my home was reduced to ashes by a catastrophic fire. At 65, I went to seek refuge with my son, but he refused to take me in, explaining that his fiancée needed her privacy. In despair, I reached out to my first love, a man I had not seen in 4 decades. When he opened the door to his grand house, he spoke only 3 words. "You finally came home." My life changed forever in that instant. But before we go further, please remember to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing how far our stories travel. My name is Eleanor Hart, and at 65, I truly believed I had already faced every hardship life could possibly offer. I was wrong. It began on a Wednesday that seemed as ordinary as any other in Portland, Oregon. I was in the kitchen preparing my afternoon coffee when a strange odor drifted through the air. Assuming I had left something on the stove, I went to check. The moment I opened the living room door, a dense wall of smoke blinded me. Flames were devouring the curtains and crawling up the walls with terrifying speed, freezing me for several fatal seconds. The smoke alarm should have been shrieking, but I later discovered the battery had died months earlier, a small neglect that would cost me everything I owned. I ran back to the kitchen, fumbling for the telephone to call the fire department, but the smoke filled every corner, clawing at my throat and fogging my thoughts. When I heard glass shatter, I knew there was no time left. The blaze was consuming my house with a ravenous hunger that could not be stopped. My only thought was survival. I snatched my purse from the kitchen table and bolted for the back door. The last thing I saw before bursting outside was the portrait of Alan, my late husband, beginning to blacken under the heat. The neighbors were already gathered in the street when I stumbled out, coughing and gasping for air. Mrs. O'Leary, my 78-year-old neighbor, was the first to reach me, wrapping her arms around me as we watched helplessly while fire devoured the home where I had lived for over 40 years. The firefighters arrived 10 minutes later, but the house was already beyond saving. They prevented the flames from spreading to nearby homes. Yet mine was doomed. Within a single hour, 4 decades of memories turned to dust. The kitchen table where Brian had done his homework, the walls etched with the marks of his childhood growth, the bedroom Alan and I had shared for 37 years, all gone. I stood on the sidewalk wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over my shoulders, watching strangers battle what used to be my life. Later, they explained it was likely caused by a short circuit in an old outlet in the living room, a simple electrical fault that destroyed everything. When the flames finally died, only a blackened skeleton remained. The fire chief approached me, face streaked with soot, eyes filled with pity I could not bear. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We did everything we could." He didn't need to finish. I could see the truth myself. A total loss. Everything I possessed except the clothes on my back and what was inside my purse was gone. That night, neighbors who still had roofs over their heads offered me shelter. Kind Mrs. O'Leary insisted I stay with her, but her small apartment was overflowing with visiting grandchildren. The Red Cross had opened temporary shelters. Yet the thought of sleeping on a cot among strangers made me feel even more displaced. That was when I knew I had to call Brian. My son lived about 40 minutes away in Lake Oswego, a refined suburb of Portland where every street was lined with manicured trees and magazine-worthy houses. He had moved there 4 years earlier after becoming a regional manager at the insurance company he worked for. We weren't close, not the way mothers and sons ought to be, but he was all the family I had left. Using Mrs. O'Leary's telephone, since mine had melted along with everything else, I dialed. "Brian, darling, it's Mom," I said, my voice trembling more than I meant. "Mom, what's wrong? You sound upset." "There was a fire." "Son, the house is gone. Everything's gone." A pause followed that seemed endless. "Were you hurt?" "No." Just a few scratches and a sore throat from the smoke. But I need a place to stay while I figure things out. Only temporarily. Another pause. Sure. Mom, come over. We'll work something out. Relief flooded through me so completely I almost collapsed. My boy would take care of me. Despite the distance, the missed calls, and the uneasy holiday dinners, he was still my child. The next morning I stared at the charred ruins, waiting for the insurance adjuster. He arrived promptly at 9, a young man who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else inspecting the remains of my home with a clipboard and camera. Total loss, he said flatly, as if those words did not represent my entire life. How much, I asked, already fearing the answer. You had a policy for about $200,000 on the structure. But after the deductible and depreciation, maybe $90,000, perhaps less? $90,000 to rebuild 42 years of life. Impossible, Mrs. O'Leary helped me buy basic clothes and toiletries with the emergency funds from the Red Cross. Everything I now owned fit into one borrowed suitcase. That was all that remained of my life's work. The drive to Brian's home felt like traveling to a foreign country. Everything looked different when you had nowhere left to return to. Familiar places, the gas station where I used to buy lottery tickets. The diner where Alan and I once had Sunday breakfasts felt as if they belonged to someone else. Lake Oswego was pristine as ever, perfect lawns, perfect sidewalks, perfect lives carrying on as if nothing had changed. I felt like an intruder, dragging my tragedy into their spotless world. His house was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a red door chosen by Cynthia, his fiancée. I had met her exactly 3 times in the 2 years they'd been together. She was 30. He was 39. A marketing executive downtown, full of opinions about everything from wall colors to dinner wine. The taxi pulled into their driveway, and I sat motionless for a moment, gathering courage. This is temporary, I told myself, just until I can figure out the next step, until the insurance check arrives and I can find a small apartment. I never imagined that walking to my son's front door with a small borrowed suitcase would be one of the hardest acts of my life. But as I lifted my hand to knock, a familiar hollow feeling returned to the same void I'd felt when Alan died, as though the ground were vanishing beneath my feet. I didn't yet realize how much further I was about to fall. Brian opened the door before I could knock, as if he had been watching. For a fleeting moment, seeing his face, Alan's eyes, my stubborn chin, made me believe everything might be all right. He was my son, my only child. Surely, blood meant something. Mom, he said, stepping aside to let me in. Yet his tone carried a hint of distance, perhaps discomfort. Cynthia appeared immediately, as though she had been waiting in the wings. She wore crisp white jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. Her brown hair was swept into one of those effortlessly messy buns that somehow looked perfect. Her smile, however, never reached her eyes. "Ellie, how awful about your house," she said, glancing not at me but at my scuffed suitcase. Brian told me what happened. I set the case down in their immaculate entryway, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked. My newly bought clothes, plain and inexpensive, seemed pitiful against the polished marble floor, despite the shower I had taken at Miss O'Leary's. The smell of smoke still clung to my hair. "It's only temporary," I said quickly, "just until I can get back on my feet." Brian and Cynthia exchanged a look. One of those silent spousal communications that exclude outsiders. Alan and I had done the same countless times. Yet from the outside it felt like being shut out of a private club. "Let's sit and talk," Brian said, leading me into the living room. Their home looked like a magazine, spread perfectly matched furniture. Spotless surfaces. White sofas that seemed untouched. glass tables reflecting sunlight through crystal clear windows. It was the kind of house where you feared leaving a fingerprint. I perched on the edge of the immaculate sofa, my modest shoes resting on flawless hardwood. Cynthia flinched slightly at the sight. "So, what's the plan?" Brian asked, settling into the armchair across from me, not beside me, where he could have offered comfort, but opposite me, as if conducting business. "Well," the insurance agent said, "it may take a few weeks, maybe a month. I hope to stay here until then, just until I can find a small apartment." The silence stretched 10 seconds too long. I saw Cynthia's expression tighten, her jaw set. She reached over and placed her hand on Brian's arm, a gesture that looked tender but felt possessive. "Mom," Brian began, and the tone told me heartbreak was coming. "The thing is, Cynthia and I really value our privacy here. We work long hours, and this is our sanctuary. If you understand." I blinkte. Stunned. "I wouldn't be in your way. I'd keep to myself. I could cook, clean anything." Cynthia leaned forward, voice gentle but firm. "It's not about inconvenience, Ellie. It's about space. This is our first home together, and we're still finding our rhythm as a couple. I'm his mother," I said, my words sharper than intended. "Of course you are," Cynthia replied smoothly. "And that's why we think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, where you can have independence while you rebuild." I turned to Brian, waiting for him to contradict her, to remember the woman who had nursed every fever, worked double shifts to pay for his textbooks, held him through the pain of divorce 3 years earlier when his wife left him for her trainer. Instead, he nodded. "Cynthia's right. Mom, we think you'd be happier in your own space." The words struck like a blow. My chest tightened as though someone were squeezing my lungs. "Happier? Brian, I lost everything yesterday. Everything. And you think I'd be happier alone in a motel room rather than with my family? It doesn't have to be a motel," Cynthia offered quickly. "There are some charming extended stay places near the mall, clean, safe, with little kitchenettes so you can cook." I stared at this woman, barely 2 years in my son's life, dictating where I should live after losing my home. And how am I supposed to pay for this lovely extended stay? The insurance money won't come for weeks. Brian shifted uncomfortably. "I could help. A few $100s to get you started." A few $100s. The words tasted bitter, as if I were a distant relative, not the woman who gave him life. "Brian," I whispered, "I changed your diapers. I rocked you through your colic. I taught you to ride a bike. I helped with your homework. I held you when Lucia Velasco broke your heart in high school." His face tightened, but Cynthia squeezed his arm harder. "No one's questioning your history," she said smoothly. "We just think everyone will be more comfortable with some boundaries." Boundaries. That word again from the therapist Brian had seen after his divorce. Everything was about boundaries. "You're throwing me out," I said flatly. "We're not throwing you out," Brian insisted. "We just think this arrangement won't work for anyone." "Whose idea was this?" I asked. Though I already knew, Cynthia leaned back, satisfied, as if she had won. "We discussed it together," Brian murmured, eyes avoiding mine. I rose slowly, my knees cracking, a cruel reminder that I was 65 and alone. "I understand." "Mom, don't be like that," he said. "We're trying to do what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone?" I repeated hollowly. "What would truly be best, Brian, is if your mother didn't have to sleep on the street tonight." Cynthia's perfect face twisted into polite concern. "You don't have to sleep on the street." As I said, there are options. I glanced around the flawless living room one last time, the photos of Brian and Cynthia. None of me, the costly furniture no one dared use, My son, who had chosen a cold, beautiful woman over his mother. "You're right," I said quietly. "There are always options." I lifted my small suitcase. It felt heavier now that I knew where I wasn't wanted. Brian stood, uneasy, but not enough to change his mind. "I'll call you in a few days," he said. "Once you're settled." "Don't bother," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I wouldn't want to intrude on your sanctuary." Cynthia looked faintly ashamed, but not enough to protest, not enough to say, "Wait, she's your mother." I walked out of that perfect house, that perfect couple, that perfect set of boundaries, and stood on the sidewalk a long time before I could move. Through the window, I saw them talking, probably about how difficult I was, how much drama I brought into their peaceful world. The irony stung. I had spent years after Alan's death convincing myself I was strong, independent, self-sufficient. Now I realized independence is a luxury one can afford only when there are choices. I trudged to a small budget hotel on the corner and spent nearly all the money I had left on a room for the night. Sitting on the hard bed, staring at peeling wallpaper, I wondered where a 65-year-old woman with almost no money and one suitcase of cheap clothes was supposed to go. That was when I remembered the business card I had carried for nearly 40 years, miraculously saved because it was in my purse during the fire yellowed. Edges soft from years of handling. A card I had never truly believed I would use. From a man I once loved when the world was young and everything felt possible. Thomas Whitaker, the man who had promised to come back for me one day, but life intervened, and the day never came. I spent 3 nights in that shabby hotel before I gathered the courage to call. 3 nights waking with an aching back from the thin mattress and a bitter taste of shame. 3 nights listening to hallway arguments and the hum of traffic outside the poorly insulated window. 3 nights washing my few clothes in the tiny bathroom and hanging them to dry on the single chair. The card felt like tissue between my fingers, worn smooth from 4 decades of being kept but never used. Thomas Whitaker was written in faded blue ink, followed by a phone number with an area code I didn't recognize. On the back, in my own youthful handwriting, were the words, "Never forget E." I had written that when I was 25, certain that Thomas Whitaker would be the great love of my life. He had been 26, with dark hair falling over his forehead and eyes the color of golden amber. After college, he worked for his father's construction company, dreaming of bigger things, of building something that mattered. We dated 9 months, which at 25 felt like forever. He used to drive me to the overlook above the city, where we'd sit on the hood of his car and talk about our futures. "I'm going to start my own business," he would tell me. "Something in construction or real estate development. Something that will make me rich enough to give you everything you deserve. I'll come back for you, Ellie." He had promised that the night before leaving for a project in San Francisco, "I'm going to make something of myself, and then I'll return and marry you." But promises made at 25 have a way of fading when real life takes over. At first, he wrote long, passionate letters filled with dreams and plans. I wrote back, telling him about my job at the bank, about how I was waiting just as I had promised. Then his letters grew shorter, rarer. When I met Alan Hart 6 months later at a church social, Thomas became a beautiful dream, too perfect to belong to the real world. Alan was steady, dependable, already 32, with a solid position at the telephone company. He didn't promise me the world. He promised me a home, a family, security. After 5 months of dating, he proposed, and I said yes. I slipped Thomas's business card into the pocket of my wedding dress, a private talisman I could never bring myself to discard. Now, 4 decades later, sitting in a shabby motel room that smelled of damp and stale cigarettes, I found myself wondering what had become of that dreamer with the amber eyes. Over the years, I kept loose tabs on him the way people do with their first great loves. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard he had honored his vows to himself. He launched a construction outfit, became a significant player. He never married, which seemed to surprise everyone, always too busy. They said, building his empire? People would shrug and say Whitaker had always been relentless. The last update I heard perhaps 8 years back was that his company had stretched beyond Oregon, with projects in San Francisco, Phoenix, and Denver. Whitaker Development was putting up shopping centers and office complexes. The young man from a family construction shop had become the sort who wore expensive suits and made choices that rippled through the lives of hundreds. What could a man like that possibly want with a 65-year-old widow holed up in a budget motor lodge with nothing but a discount store suitcase? The rational part of me called it absurd, even pathetic. You do not phone someone after 40 years because your life has unraveled. You do not go digging for a youthful love when you are older, desperate, and out of options. But reason is a luxury when you are counting quarters in your purse and trying to decide whether you can afford one more night. On the fourth morning, I could not bear it anymore. My back ached from the thin mattress. The money was dwindling, and the clerk had already warned me the room would be needed for a booking the next day. I sat at the little Formica table, staring at the card, my hands shaking from more than the morning chill. What could I even say? Hello? Thomas. Remember me. I am homeless now. Can you help? The number was probably dead, or else some receptionist would inform me, ever so politely, that Mr. Whitaker was too important to take calls from strangers claiming to know him from long ago. But what if it wasn't dead? What if he answered? My heart hammered as I dialed, each digit feeling like a step off a cliff. It rang once, twice. Whitaker Development, Thomas speaking. His voice was deeper, shaped by time and responsibility, but it was unmistakably his. After 40 years, I would have recognized it anywhere. I almost hung up my thumb, hovered over the cradle as if to end the call and find another way to survive. But there was a warmth in his tone that flowed through the line and wrapped around me like a blanket. And I spoke. Thomas. It's Ellie. Ellie Hart. I used to be Eleanor Hartwell. I still am, but silence stretched just long enough for panic to rush in. Maybe the call had dropped. Maybe he had hung up. Maybe he had no idea who I was. Then Ellie, only my name, said like a prayer, like a small miracle, as though he could not quite believe it. I rushed on, the words tumbling over one another in fear he might end the call. I'm sorry to call like this. I know it's been ages, and I probably shouldn't be bothering you, but I didn't know who else to turn to. Where are you? He cut in, the concern sharp in his voice. Portland, at a place called the Sunset Motor Lodge. This will sound insane, but my house burned down last week. I lost everything. My son, he doesn't want me staying with him. I have nowhere else to go. The confession poured out, each phrase harder than the last. Admitting your own child refused. You feels like admitting failure at something sacred. Give me the exact address. Thomas said, his tone turning brisk and entirely professional. I'm coming to get you. You don't have to do that. I don't even know why I called. I think I just needed a friendly voice. Ellie, tell me where you are. I'm walking to my car right now. Through the handset, I heard a door shut, an engine turn over. He was truly coming. This man I had not spoken to in 4 decades was dropping whatever mattered that morning to pull me out of a no-name motel. I gave him the address in a whisper. Thomas, look. I'm not the girl you remember. Neither am I, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But I have been waiting 40 years for this call. After we hung up, I spent the next hour packing my few things. swinging between panic and disbelief. What on earth was I doing? What were we doing? You cannot pick up a life after 4 decades, as if you paused the conversation yesterday. Yet as I stood at the window, waiting for a car I might not recognize, carrying a man who might not recognize me, something rose in my chest that I had not felt since before the fire hope. Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps it would only lead to more disappointment, but it was hope all the same. And at 65, with nothing left to lose, hope felt worth the gamble. At precisely 10:45, a silver Mercedes rolled to a stop outside, gleaming against the tired street. My heart fluttered like a trapped bird as it parked. The windows were tinted. I could not see the driver. But somewhere deep inside, I knew it was him. The engine cut off. The driver's door opened. And even with silver in his hair and decades I had not shared etched around his eyes, I recognized him instantly. Thomas Whitaker stepped from the car as if he had walked out of a memory. And when he glanced up toward my window, the years between us seemed to crumble. I grabbed my suitcase and hurried down the stairs, moving with the urgency of someone afraid a dream might vanish if she hesitated. He was waiting by the car. He carried the same calm confidence he had at 26. Only now, it was tempered and refined by success. He wore dark denim and a navy sweater that likely cost more than I would have spent on a month of groceries in my leanest years. But his eyes, those amber eyes that had followed me through decades, were exactly the same. Part of me wanted to hide, to run back to the room and pretend none of this was happening. My hair needed cutting. My budget clothes were wrinkled. And beside this elegant man, I felt small and shabby, but he was already smiling. A smile that made my heart leap as if I were 25 again. I stepped closer, breath-catching. "Hello, Ellie," he said gently. Time had left its signatures on him, salt and pepper hair cut short and neat. Lines bracketing his eyes and mouth. Broader shoulders, the kind of solidity success sometimes gives a person. Yet when he smiled, I saw the boy who once took me to the Overlook and told me what he planned to build. "Hello," I managed, barely above a whisper. He studied my face for a long moment, those amber eyes taking in every detail. I wanted to apologize for how I looked, for how far I had fallen, for showing up after all these years with nothing but trouble to offer. Instead, he gave me 3 words that shifted the ground beneath my feet. "You look beautiful." I burst into tears right there on the sidewalk in front of that tired motel while Thomas Whitaker stood beside me. 4 decades of stored-up grief. 4 days of anxiety and despair. A lifetime of being told I was never quite enough. All of it rushed out in ragged sobs I could not control. He did not hush me or promise that everything would be fine. He simply took my suitcase with one hand and wrapped his other arm around me as I collapsed against his chest. He smelled of expensive cologne and freshly laundered wool, of stability and success, of everything I had lost and everything I had never held. His sweater was soft against my cheek, his arms steady around my trembling shoulders. "I'm sorry." I choked against him. "I'm sorry. Thomas, I shouldn't have called. I shouldn't drag you into this." "Shh," he murmured, palm moving in slow circles on my back. "You should have called years ago." When the storm finally passed, I stepped back, mortified by the damp blotch I had left on his sweater. I must look a wreck. He brushed a tear from my cheek with a touch as light as breath. "You look like someone who has walked through fire and survived. That is not a wreck, Ellie. That is strength." I laughed, but it came out thin and bitter. "Strength? I am 65. Living in a dive because my own son does not want me. That is not strength. That is pathetic." His jaw tightened. For a heartbeat I saw anger he tried to swallow. "Your son is a fool. You do not know him. I do not need to." "I know you," he said, hands still resting lightly on my shoulders. Or at least I knew you and the Ellie Hart I knew would never turn away family in need. The way he said my name like something precious he had kept safe made my chest ache for the woman I used to be. That was a long time ago. I whispered, I am not that girl anymore. Maybe not, he conceded, but I would like to meet the woman she became. He placed my suitcase in the trunk with absurd care, as if it were treasure rather than a cheap bag holding the last of my life. When he opened the passenger door, the unreality of it all struck me that morning after the fire. I had a house and a lifetime of memories. Now I was stepping into the car of a man I had not seen in 40 years, with no idea where this road led. Where are we going? I asked, as the engine purred to life. Home, he said simply. We drove for nearly an hour, through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent, until we reached an area I had never visited. Rolling hills dotted with estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates. Trees that looked deliberately placed. Mailboxes that probably cost more than most people's cars. Thomas turned into a long drive marked only by a small brass plaque Whitaker. The lane curved through mature trees and careful gardens before opening onto a circular approach facing a house that stole my breath. It was not gaudy. It was the kind of elegance real money buys restrained. Confident. Built to endure. Stone and wood. Tall windows catching the afternoon light. And a porch that invited you to linger. Thomas, I whispered, taking in the monument to everything he had achieved. This is incredible. He parked, but did not move to get out. Instead, he gazed at the house as if seeing it through my eyes. It's too big, he said softly. It always has been. I built it thinking I would fill it one day. But he shrugged. Ah, Hester, so familiar it made my heart twist. Some dreams do not land the way you plan. You never married. The question escaped before I could catch it. He turned. Unreadable. I came close a couple of times. But something was always missing. A beat. You. The single word lingered in the quiet car, heavy with 40 years of what-ifs. I wanted to ask what that truly meant, how I could be missing from a life I had never lived with him, but before I could form the words, he was already circling the hood to open my door. Inside, the house was even more stunning. Honey-bright hardwood floors, high ceilings, furniture that could have graced an architecture magazine yet somehow did not feel cold. Books everywhere, comfortable reading chairs by the windows, photographs scattered across end tables. It felt inhabited, not staged. Are you hungry? Thomas asked, ushering me into a kitchen larger than my old living room. I was about to make lunch when you called. Only then did I realize how empty my stomach was. The motel breakfast had been stale toast and weak coffee. I do not want to be a burden, I began. But he stopped me with a look. Ellie. Enough. You are not a burden. You are. He searched for the right phrase. You are the answer to a question I have been asking for 40 years. While he cooked, and he truly could cook, moving through that generous kitchen with the ease of a man who had learned to care for himself, I wandered through the room's small museum of photographs. Thomas at ribbon cuttings. Thomas shaking hands with power brokers. Thomas with elegant women at charity galas, always smiling, never quite looking joyful. Tell me about your life, he said at last, setting down a plate of perfectly grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. Tell me about Alan. About your son, everything I missed. So I did. Over a meal that tasted like heaven after days of terrible motel food. I told him about my marriage to Alan, steady and safe, full of companionship if not fire. I told him about Brian, the baby I had longed for and loved fiercely, who grew into a man who valued his fiancée's comfort over his mother's need. I told him about years spent being a good wife, a good mother, a good widow, about the fire that took what I owned and the son who took what remained. Thomas listened without interruption, his amber eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry," he said at last. "I am sorry about Alan. About your house. About your son. But I am not sorry you called me." "Why?" The word came out smaller than I intended. He reached across and took my hand, still strong. "Stilientle. Still capable of making my heart race after all these years. Because I never stopped loving you. Because every deal I struck, every success I notched, every dollar I earned, I wanted to be worthy of you, if you ever found your way back to me." "Thomas, it sounds mad. I know 40 years is a lifetime, and we are not the same people. But when I heard your voice today, it was like a missing piece finally slid into place." I studied our linked hands, his tanned and well-kept, mine worn by work and etched with every day of my 65 years. "I am not the girl you remember. You are better," he said, shaking his head. "You are real. You have lived and loved and lost and survived. That 25-year-old was beautiful, but she was only potential. You are the woman that potential became." His words settled around my heart like a warm blanket, mending wounds I hadn't realized were still open. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt seen not as someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's obligation, but as myself. "What happens now?" I asked. Thomas smiled, that same arresting smile that once undid me when the world was young. "Now we figure out the shape of the years ahead together, if you will have me." Sitting there in his beautiful kitchen, full of good food and unlooked-for possibility, I understood that sometimes the fire that raises your old life is clearing space for the life you were meant to live. Moving into Thomas's world felt like rediscovering a version of myself I had lost. The first week was awkward. We tiptoed like polite strangers, sharing rooms. He gave me the entire guest suite, larger than my old living room, with a private bath, big enough for two, and a cozy sitting area that looked out over his gardens. I felt like a guest in a luxury hotel, afraid to touch much or leave traces of my presence. But Thomas was patient, the kind of patience successful men have to learn, and slowly I exhaled. He had a housekeeper, Rosa, who came 3 days a week. But on the other days I found myself cooking. It began modestly: morning coffee, simple lunch. Thomas appreciated everything with the enthusiasm of someone who had eaten catered food and restaurant fare for decades. "This is incredible," he said one evening, savoring the chicken and dumplings I made from my grandmother's recipe. "I have not had a home-cooked meal like this in years. It is nothing special." I protested, even as something warm glowed inside me. When was the last time anyone truly appreciated my cooking? Brian used to grumble that I repeated the same 5 dishes. Cynthia once suggested I try more contemporary flavors for family dinners. Thomas only shook his head. "It is perfect. You are perfect." That word should have unsettled me. I was 65, gray at the roots. My expression lines now permanent grooves. My hands were freckled with age, my body soft where once it had been firm. I was anything but perfect. Yet in Thomas's gaze, I saw a woman who was beautiful, worthy of attention and gentle care. We fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. We ate breakfast on the back porch, Thomas scanning business briefs while I watched the birds crowd his elaborate feeders. In the afternoons, we walked the grounds as he showed me the beds he had planted and the greenhouse where he kept his orchids. Evenings were for conversation. We had 40 years to sift through, and we did it slowly, carefully, like archaeologists brushing dust from precious artifacts. I told him how devastating it had been to lose Alan, about the hollow echo of the house in the months that followed, how I had to force myself out of bed each morning, and the aching solitude of widowhood, the way people treat you like half a person once your husband is gone. He told me about his work, how it had grown from a modest construction shop into a development empire with projects across 3 states, and about the women he had dated over the years, bright, accomplished women who looked flawless beside him at charity galas, yet never made him feel complete. There was one in particular, he said one night, as we sat by his fireplace with rain drumming against the windows. Elena, he said. She was an architect, brilliant and beautiful. Everyone said we were perfect together. A sharp, unexpected stab of jealousy went through me. What happened? I asked. I proposed, he answered softly. On Christmas Eve 5 years ago, Big Chester, a restaurant with a view over the city, an expensive ring. Everything she said she wanted, and she said yes. We planned a wedding for the following summer. But as the date approached, I kept feeling that something was wrong. Not with her. She was everything anyone could want in a wife, but with me. He paused, staring into the flames. The night before the wedding, I called it off. Thomas. No. What did you tell her? The truth? He looked at me, his eyes solemn. That I was still in love with a woman I had met 40 years earlier, and it would not be fair to marry while my heart belonged to someone else. The words struck like a physical blow. You canceled your wedding for me? I whispered. For the memory of me, for the possibility that someday, somehow, I might need you and you would be here. I thought, studying this successful, handsome man who could have had anyone, trying to absorb what he had confessed. This is madness. I said, it is. He agreed. He leaned forward and took my hands. Crazier still that you kept my business card in your wallet for 40 years. He was right. Yes. We were both a little mad. We had both lived alongside the ghosts of what might have been, but somehow, against all sense, our particular kind of madness had led us back to each other. 3 weeks after I moved in, Brian called. I was in Thomas's kitchen, making dinner, actually humming. Something I had not done in years when the phone rang. Seeing Brian's name made my stomach clench with familiar dread. Hello? Dear, I said, keeping my tone even. Mom, he replied, voice strangely controlled. I've been trying to reach you. Your phone goes straight to voicemail. That was true. I had been screening my calls, not ready for whatever guilt or duty he might try to lay at my feet. I've been busy with what I heard you checked out of the motel weeks ago. Where are you staying? I looked around Thomas's beautiful kitchen at the fresh flowers he had brought that morning. The crystal glasses on the counter. With a friend? I said. What friend, Mom? You don't have friends with money. The assumption offended me, partly because for so long after Alan died it had been true. Would that surprise you? I asked. Coolly. He fell silent. I could almost hear him processing. Mom, we should talk. Cynthia and I have discussed things and we think maybe we were too hasty. Maybe you could use our guest room for a while, just until you're back on your feet. An offer that would have meant everything a month earlier now felt hollow. Even insulting. What changed your mind? I asked. Another pause. We realized we were too focused on our own needs. Families should stick together. What he meant, I realized, was that the neighborhood grapevine had reported I was no longer in a cut-rate motel. Someone had mentioned seeing me with a well-dressed man in a fine car. Brian was curious, and curiosity had made him generous. That's very kind, I said, but I'm perfectly content where I am. Mom, you can't just move in with a stranger. It isn't safe. What do you even know about this man? I know he has never made me feel like a burden, I answered quietly. I know he values my company, appreciates my cooking, and tells me I am beautiful every single day. The wedding we planned bore no resemblance to my first. When I married Alan 40 years earlier, it had been about what everyone else expected: a white dress, a church ceremony, a reception at the community hall with a DJ and a cash bar. We invited everyone we knew and a few we didn't particularly like, because that was what one did. We performed the ritual for the crowd, not for ourselves. This time, Thomas and I did exactly what we wanted. We held the ceremony in his backyard on a crisp November morning. 5 months after that call from the motel, the officiant was Reverend Collins, an old friend of Thomas's, and the only witnesses were Rosa, his housekeeper, and Peter, his business partner and closest friend of 25 years. I wore a simple blue dress that Thomas claimed matched my eyes, and he wore a gray suit that made him look both distinguished and irresistibly handsome. No fuss, no spectacle, no pressure to impress. Just two people who had found each other again after 4 decades, promising to share whatever years remained. Brian came. I had debated inviting him at all, but Thomas urged me to try once more. "He's your son," he said. "You'll regret it if you don't give him the chance to make it right." So I called him 2 weeks before the ceremony. "Thomas and I are getting married," I said plainly. "November 15th, at 2 o'clock. You're welcome to attend. But Cynthia is not invited." He arrived alone, ill at ease in a suit that likely cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He shook Thomas's hand, made polite small talk, and even managed a strained smile when Reverend Collins declared us husband and wife. But I could see the calculation in his gaze the way he inventoried Thomas's house, his car, the unmistakable signs of wealth. This morning I woke in Thomas's arms, in my husband's arms, in the room that became ours, in the house that became our home. Sunlight poured through the windows overlooking the gardens we tend together, and I could smell the coffee Thomas brews every morning before I rise. At 66, I am happier than I have ever been, not because of his money, or his lovely house, or his achievements, but because someone sees me, truly sees me, and chooses to love what he sees. The fire consumed my old life and reduced it to ash. Yet sometimes, as I watch Thomas reading the morning paper across the breakfast table, I think destruction is simply another word for renewal. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover everything you truly need. And sometimes, if fortune is very, very kind, first love is granted a second chance to become forever love. The business card I guarded for 40 years is framed now, resting on Thomas's desk in his study, a reminder that some promises are worth keeping, even when it takes 4 decades to fulfill them. Did you enjoy the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If this story moved you, you can offer a super thanks so I can keep sharing more tales like it. Thank you deeply for your kind support. I look forward to reading what you think. On the screen, you'll find 2 new life stories I highly recommend. There is much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect. Did you enjoy the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked it, you can send a super thanks so I can continue bringing more stories your way. Thank you so much for your generous support. I'm excited to hear your thoughts. On the screen, you can see 2 more life stories I strongly recommend. There is plenty more on my channel. Remember to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.